Hello, Sara. Welcome back to the show.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Wow, it feels like all roads have led us to this moment. It feels perfect. So yes, I'm very happy we are here having this particular conversation at this particular time.
Yeah, me too, me too. And yeah, I didn't realise I would be interviewing you for this, but it's a topic that I'm wanting to know answers to. So yeah, great that I get to ask the questions.
Well, hence you're the perfect person.
So, shall we dive in?
Let's.
Okay. So, really, first of all, I'd love to hear what is the feminine?
Start with a simple one.
Well, I just feel without that, where people will be listening to this conversation with through whichever lens they have. So I'm curious as to how you would describe the feminine, what the feminine is, and then we can go from there.
Certainly, yeah, it is. It's the right place to start. So, as I've been pondering this, as you know, I've been planning to record this episode, and at the time I was planning just to record it on my own. And I've been thinking about it over the last month. And what's become increasingly clear to me, it's going to sound obvious, but it has ramifications that I think aren't necessarily always seen, is that we can't have an experience of the feminine objectively. We're always doing that through the embodiment of whoever we are. And in this instance, you and I as women. And that can seem as though it's almost a problem, like as in somehow we need to take ourselves out of it to be able to have that direct experience. But more and more, that feels to me that recognizing that the feminine will always be in relationship to us as women in women's bodies, the more we recognize that is how it is, I'm not even going to say the closer or the truer our experience of the feminine is, because I don't even necessarily know that's the objective here, but the richer, the more beautiful, the more like of the feminine, ironically, our experience of the feminine is. I was also, as I was planning this, I looked up the dictionary definition of the feminine, and it made me laugh because I was like, oh my goodness, when we've been in this work for some time, thinking about the feminine and talking about the feminine and often thinking about these like big grand ideas and, abstract concepts, it really made me chuckle when I looked at the dictionary definition, which is, in short, of or relating to women or girls. There's different variations of that, like characteristic of or appropriate or unique to women, having characteristics that are traditionally thought to be typical or suitable for a woman. And I was really laughing at that, like, oh my goodness, doesn't that like just bring it all down to like something so simple? And yet, for all kinds of reasons, we've kind of come really so far away from that it's a surprise to read that that's the dictionary definition of the feminine. Well, I'd love to know, before I go on, like what comes up for you as I say that?
What comes up for me, firstly, is I wonder whether that's where I've sort of seen feminine with a little f and feminine with a large f. So almost like splitting it into the human and the divine is what was the initial thing that came up for me hearing that dictionary definition.
Yes, and there's definitely truth there, and we could definitely say, well, yes, the dictionary definition is feminine with a small f, and there is this idea that we have of feminine with a big F, but more and more I'm seeing that there is a Aidan Wachter, a previous guest on the show, talked about they're kind of the same stone. They're not even two sides of the same coin. They're the same stone.
Mm, mm. And that's really interesting, and you know, maybe we'll be able to get into this in this conversation, but that brings to mind a curiosity around the idea that the feminine could be in a man's body. Like, how is that? Yeah, hearing you say that it's the same stone just suddenly has made me think about other ways people have interpreted the feminine and attribute it to different people, and what's the truth in that.
And of course, everything I'm saying is my own gnosis, my own lived experience I'm now speaking from. And do other people have different experiences and different gnosis? Almost certainly. And it doesn't feel at all serving for me to say that's not true, this is true. What I can say is, and you know, you've heard me talk about this before, there was many years where I very much taught this work of reclaiming the feminine, it's very specifically the wild feminine, which I'm sure we'll get into. I very much did teach it from that place of like inner masculine, inner feminine, and also these archetypal energies of the divine masculine, divine feminine. And then we were kind of in the work of one way or another kind of honoring, reclaiming them, embodying them. And then at some point, as the focus was very clearly for me much more on the reclamation of the feminine for various reasons that are personal to me. I'm sure I've mentioned on the show before, I had an upbringing, and also I think just this was kind of meant to be my soul's path, where I lived in a way that was so dishonoring, in denial of the feminine. I was an absolute tomboy. I was raised by a single father. I had very little in the way of kind of female role models growing up. So for me, so much of the focus has been in recent years in reclaiming the feminine, and very specifically, and I think often this is the bit that can be overlooked or bypassed, really healing the wounds that had that be so hard for me, so painful, so scary for me to be able to embody what really looks to me now, my soul, what I'm here for. It's required so much work of seeing the shadow that was in the way of that. And as I did that, there was a point, and again, not to say that I'm done, but there was a point where enough of that shadow was integrated that I realized, like, so many things that I attributed to the masculine were actually just shadow. So many things, some of the ways of being that felt to me like, oh, this is the masculine aspect of me. As I alchemized that shadow, those ways of being were actually just forms of protection, forms of armor, forms of just ways of saying to the world, like, no, you can't come here, it's not okay. And I was left at this place when I was like, this is really inconvenient, but it doesn't now make sense to me personally it's not even like a kind of do or don't want to, it just, I can't feel that in here. Saying that, and I think this is a really important part of this, is not to say that I actually feel like I can locate in me an inner feminine either. Neither are there. Like, it's just like, if I go looking for either, there isn't a place in me that I could say there's an inner feminine that resides or an inner masculine that resides. What I do know is the truth of my own body, which is a woman, which, as far as I can see, is an expression, a physical expression of the feminine. And I do have a relationship, which again isn't sort of separate to that, but I do have a relationship with something that I would call the feminine, the goddess. And that is through, again, my own body. It isn't something I can kind of like access separate to that. But I do also know that's something that's greater than this kind of fractal of the feminine. So again, if it can be helpful, and I'm really happy to go into a bit more detail here if there's something that is there for you to ask, but could it be helpful for us to look at different archetypes? You know, the masculine and feminine very much can be an archetype, an archetypal form of energy. Could it be helpful to look at the archetype of the masculine and be inspired by that, to see parts of that that could be really healthy and useful for us? Undoubtedly. That to me isn't the same as this sense of having an inner masculine.
Yeah. Yeah, I felt so much in what you were sharing there. And I suppose the only little piece that popped up was around you saying that how you show up is an expression of the feminine, and not all women show up looking the way that you do. And I'm just curious as to, I mean, obviously we don't know what their relationship is with the feminine, but I'm just wondering if there's anything to say on that. You look a particular way, and I would, say yes, very feminine, but it also doesn't feel quite truthful to say that somebody showing up that didn't look like you was not feminine, if that makes sense.
Yeah, completely. This to me calls to mind the conversation we were in just before we started recording about the wild feminine, and particularly about, I can show the particular artwork, Ellen of the Ways, who is a wild goddess, probably the most ancient that we know of the British Isles, most ancient goddess. And what I've seen to be true is that as we devote to reclaiming our wildness, we understand like what that is meant to be expressed like. And it will vary from woman to woman. It absolutely will, because it is meant to be an expression of their soul. I actually saw a quote that I posted absolutely years ago, and I happened to see it the other day, and it's by Marion Woodman. And she wrote, "Soul to me means embodied essence. When we experience ourselves and others in our full humanity, part animal, part divine. Healing comes through the embodiment of the soul." Soul to me means embodied essence. And what we're talking about here, like for me, in my embodied essence is, and it's hard to say includes or it's this and this, because again, they come together, but in order to be able to even speak about them intelligibly, I kind of almost have to separate them. But that's this body, which is a woman's body, and all that being in a woman's body brings, that cyclical nature, that ability to birth, all of those things that come as part of being in a woman's body, and my own unique soul, the wildness of my own unique soul. And that will be expressed differently through me, because mine's unique, differently through this woman's body than it would be another woman and another woman, another one. It just happens. And this is linked to this. Interestingly, I was doing some homework related to some work I'm in with my newest mentor, which I think, as you know, she's a female elder. British shamanism is what she's had handed down to her for through this amazing unbroken lineage. And she was asking me to kind of create this mind map of my life. And the interesting part of this is I was recognizing how much the things that nourish my soul are the same things that nourish all these other parts of my life. And very specifically, what I saw was this commonality of creating beauty is so important to me. That's the thing I would do for no reason, no outcome. It's just part of my soul is around creating beauty. And so that's why for me, it just happens that that is like a, you know, what other people see as this kind of almost stereotypical expression of the feminine. It just happens that that is so aligned for my soul that it looks this way. Doesn't mean that's the only way to express the feminine. Absolutely does not.
So what I'm curious about is you recognized, almost sort of like in looking back, that there was shadow involved in the repression of expressing the feminine, and embodying the feminine. So how would somebody discern, I suppose, between whether they were being their, that gorgeous quote there, and now I'm going to butcher it, the soul being your essence or expression of your essence. Yeah, you'll have to remind me of what exactly what the quote was, but it made sense to me. How would somebody know whether they were being that or whether there was shadow involved, as the case was for you and the feminine?
I think the only way we know is by devoting to something as the North Star. In my case, it was twofold. There was a very intentional, I've spoken about this many times before, but there was a very intentional choice to live from soul that I made a number of years ago now. And very soon afterwards, there was this very clear calling to also devote to the feminine. And it's in doing so, is that kind of having that as the North Star, I get to see all the places that I can't do that. All the places I'm like, oh, that's actually the hardest, worst, most repellent thing ever. That's the shadow. But it's only by kind of having that devotion I get to see that there isn't a way that we can theoretically get to it. We have to live it.
Yeah. And would you just remind me of that quote, because I loved it. And
yeah, it's particularly the words that really I think are, for me, just so beautifully capture what we're talking about here is embodied essence. That's the whole point. It's, if we don't include this body, it isn't really, it's not soul, because it has to be embodied. Soul to me means embodied essence, when we experience ourselves and others in our full humanity, part animal, part divine. Healing comes through the embodiment of the soul. I mean, it's literally, yeah, mic drop moment, because again, you know, looking at the work I've been in, which you could say is healing, people use different words, but ultimately it is a healing. It's I mean, again, that's a very shamanic term. We've got all these like modern ideas of like, oh, we shouldn't use the word healing, or that suggests brokenness. Like, more and more I see that the deeper I go into the shamanic world for you, the more I recognize like it is healing. Actually, we can use other terms if we want, but ultimately it is healing. And it's in that, it's being able to recognize the places that we are closed and hurting and wounded, and healing those, that allows us to fully embody our soul in the places that previously couldn't, which again, for me, was very related to that expression of the feminine. And quite frankly, I think I'm a very extreme example of that, in terms of how hard it was for me, how disconnected I was from the feminine, and also the other, you know, often is the case. It's like, and actually what was most aligned for me. But, you know, through the work that we do with women, to one extent or other, that's actually true for so many women.
Yes, yeah, definitely. So I'd like to move on to this devotion and this choice that you made, um, because I think that that will then lead us into what practically being this embodiment looks like day to day.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, could you just share a bit on making that choice and devotion and how that fits with this?
Would you? I feel like there's a question beneath the question. Would you mind just seeing if you could ask me that a different way, please?
Hmm. I'd like to know how you were called into devotion, what that looked like, what how that was for you.
Mm. And specifically to the feminine.
To the feminine, yes.
I can feel so much emotion rising that you've clearly asked the right question for a start. What occurs to me is that she'd been calling for so many years prior to that, but I needed to make that first devotion to soul to even recognize that. I was absolutely blind to her, to that call, because I was also just had no idea that there was even a soul that I could be living from, honestly. You know, just like you, I came from a spiritual understanding, which it is actually nothing to do with the teachings themselves, just to be clear. I could say, oh, it was the way it was taught, but it wasn't. My experience was actually direct. It was much more the experience I'd had personally of spirit were much more akin to kind of oneness, and no sense of kind of there being kind of, you know, feminine, masculine, goddess, any of that, let alone a sense of my own unique soul. And then it just happened that the teachings I was then drawn into compounded that way of seeing things, which is also there and true. Just to be clear, it's not that I'm saying that doesn't exist. It's just very much that at that point there hadn't been that sense of and. So the point where that and there is soul was illuminated for me was the point where I was then able to start to hear what was for me. That had to come first for fairly obvious reasons. And then I now look back and I just think, oh my goodness, I can see in so many different ways how I was being already called before realizing that she was. So I guess the most tangible way to speak about this actually, I'm going to say something first and then I'm going to talk about this part. So you've heard me talk before about my relationship with the rose. And in some ways, it was really the rose that had been speaking to me for so many years before that. I've shared before how the Waterhouse portrait, Soul of the Rose, that had actually been, and the irony is the name, Soul of the Rose, that had been a North Star for me for so many years before I had any understanding of any of what we're talking about before. I didn't know why, but if you look at that painting, is there, you know, everything we're talking about here is in that painting. And I knew that was for me, that the energy that painting emanates, I knew that was my North Star without really knowing how or why, but I trusted there was something in that was for me. The rose was speaking to me in all sorts of other ways. It's always been something, you know, every time I have a piece of land, one of the first things I'll do is plant roses. So it's been, a lot of it was through this relationship, this call that I had from the rose, without really understanding. It was so easy to dismiss it. It's just like, you know, hey, they're beautiful things. Why wouldn't I love them? But I always sort of knew there was something deeper. So that was one of the most tangible ways. Then, and this pulls together so many different things that we've been talking about. I had this, again, like it was a very, often is the case with me, I have almost like a pull relationship to something I'm being called to, and I also have this kind of like, oh, that's the last thing I want to do. And I had this call to understand more about polarity, and I had already a very clear understanding of polarity when it wasn't about men and women. So I'd spent time really going deep into Taoism. So this idea of sort of yin yang polarity already was very embodied in me, but the idea of that being anything about masculine, feminine, men, women was still just like yuck. And then I had this real call to kind of start to understand it in the kind of polarity terms, masculine, feminine polarity terms. And so I simultaneously was starting to look at what was out there, you know, other people's teachings, readings, things like that. And then realize, like, okay, what I would like to do, not would like to, actually, that's not right. Like, I didn't like this, but what I'm going to do is learn from a teacher who is so far in that direction that kind of, for me, is still quite repellent. I'm really going to get to see the places where I have those edges. And so that's what I did. I really kind of like decided to go all in and see what was there for me. And simultaneously, the interesting thing was, what also suddenly became very clear to me was the embodiment of an archetype called the wild priestess. It was just like came through very clearly. And at that point, I wasn't working with archetypes. I didn't really have any real reason why this archetype had made herself known, but she was. I can really see now how she brought in so many aspects of who I actually am. This was way before I had any understanding of really very much of what we're talking about. And yet that archetype was already speaking to me. She includes, of course, the feminine, the work of archetypes, the magic, the spirituality of the priestess, and then the wildness, you know, that deep connection with the land, shamanism, all was in that archetype. I had no idea why I was being called. I just knew I was. So that, in a very long-winded answer to your question, is how, I think you sort of said, you know, how did you get that call? It was multifaceted, and a lot of it is kind of connecting the dots backwards, but that's how.
Yeah, and I love that you added there that it was multifaceted, that it's not just sort of like, you know, a I don't know, like an earthquake, and you kind of got and it's like there. It's like lots of pieces that you were able to. The word submit came to mind, but I don't know if that's the right word. But you know, you followed them, all of these different. Something in you knew they were for you, even though you might not have liked going in certain directions. There was still this sense of, okay, I might not like it, but I know that it's for me, so I'm going forward with this. And is that something that devotion gives? Is this, even though it might, because sometimes what I'm trying to say is, somebody doing something that doesn't feel comfortable could be seen as that's not the direction to go in. So I'd just like to clarify that piece on that knowing of what's for you and what's not for you, if you wouldn't mind.
And just to say, this is something that in the early stages of this kind of path is not as obvious, but we kind of have to like just trust that what we do know is enough to kind of like just give us that next breadcrumb. Over time, that becomes undeniable, where we'll do things that like we really don't want to do on one level, but we just so know it's for us, we'll do anyway. Typically, we aren't shown things like that too soon because we just never would choose them. So I'd again really say if what we're talking about here sounds like a bit kind of too big to just kind of like know with any degree of certainty, like start where you are. There's something you're feeling call you, there's something that you know is for you, and it might seem quite small and insignificant, but just start there and trust that, and recognize, just as you're saying, I think very few things that are these kind of, not the end bits and pieces that make it up, because as we're about to get into when we start to talk about a kind of day in the life of, some of the things I do are absolutely gorgeous and I have no resistance to them, but the path itself is often where the resistance will show up. You've heard me talk before about the level of resistance I had to going into shamanism, like absolutely huge. And typically for me, there'll be a kind of human element of just fear, you know, primal fear of the unknown, completely understandable. And there'll be a shadow part of me. Oh Christ, just slipped off my armchair bit. Often the shadow part of me will show up in a kind of almost anger, and like a just denial. Like, why should I have to do this? I don't want to do this. I kind of very much like, that's how people's will show up differently, but that's definitely how mine shows up. And being quite like, you know, I've spoken a lot about fairness, but often mine, even though I have like a level of understanding these things aren't fair, there isn't a kind of fair does not come into it. Often that's how I'll feel it, like, it's not fair. Like, why do I have to do this bloody thing that I just don't have no real human desire to do? And yet I can feel I'm meant to be doing. Often that's how I'll experience it. And again, we get better and better at knowing that something is aligned for us, even with all of that going on.
Yeah. What I visualize there is almost like a younger self kind of wanting things to be all, you know, easygoing, happy, and
yeah, which is what it is, isn't it, really? You know, that is what shadow is like. There's a younger Lian that's just like, why on earth can't I have this in a way that's kind of like comfortable and luxurious and pleasurable and doesn't require for me to be out of my comfort zone, like completely understandably. And it's not to say those voices, you know, should be dismissed. They absolutely need to be welcomed and loved and tended, and letting them take the reins is going to just completely get in the way of having a life that's the one that you came here for.
And the irony is, or the paradox is, that in living from soul, there is, I mean, I don't think you can really quantify it, but it's, you know, it's freedom. It has so much abundance and in it that it completely would blow any ideas of you know, what's luxurious, what's easy, what's comfortable out of the water.
Yes, yeah, totally, yeah. This feels like a really good segue point, I don't know if you agree, into the kind of day of the life, because I think there's lots in that will very much support what you're saying there.
Yes, please, because that is the title. And we know from members of the Facebook group and receiving emails that people are wanting to know more about how you in particular, Lian, show up day to day. What is the embodiment of the feminine day to day? What are the sort of practices? What does your life look like? So yeah. Do we literally do a 24-hour clock? I don't know. Let's just see how you feel about how you want to share a day in the life of the feminine.
So I'll say at the outset, I think some of my reluctance to do this before was this, going back to what you said, you know, my expression of the feminine is right for me. And I'm no way saying that it's right for every woman. There's, I would say, commonalities. And I'm really happy to give some details, because it's sometimes in hearing that detail, we can kind of get closer to what is for us, either that it's not what I'm talking about, or it might inspire something that's right for another woman. So I'm going to say that first of all, because there's definitely been a reluctance in me to speak about these things for that reason, and I can really see now there is value. Again, I've been asked this quite a lot recently, so it's it feels that it's of the moment. The part that I think is, as a kind of, before we start to go into the details, I'm going to just say these almost like kind of foundational pillars that I think absolutely are going to be true for most women. Is more and more I create my life in a way that does honor my woman's body, which happens to be also very in alignment to my devotion to the feminine. Again, that's what I mean. It's like the more we honor this body, not as being separate to the feminine, but as an expression of the feminine, the more we are in devotion to the feminine, the more we are expressing the feminine anyway. And so for me being able to honor my woman's body is to recognize that it's sensitive. I mean, a more sensitive body than if I was in a man's body on average. And mine is a particularly sensitive version of that. And so part of my day is honoring that sensitivity. Another part is honoring the fact a woman's body is cyclical. There's obviously the kind of cycle she goes through her life, but there's also that the menstrual cycle that, again, the more we honor that, the healthier and happier we are, quite frankly. It's as simple as that, is what I've just seen over and over again. It is that simple. We honor that menstrual cycle, we honor ourselves. There's also part of honoring this woman's body is to recognize its orientation, which, again, this is going to be a spectrum for sure, but I would say on average, a woman is likely to have a sense of kind of fulfillment when she is more kind of home, family, village focused. When I'm pouring my love into those around me, into my home. And the more opportunities I give myself to do that, again, the more fulfilled I am. So that's part of kind of like my foundation of my life is based on those things that just make my body happy, as it were, make that woman's body happy. And then there's, going back to that idea, there is like a feminine that exists outside me. Again, I can only experience it through me, but I do have a relationship with the divine feminine, and recognizing what that feels like and having more of that in my life, that the love, the creativity, the mystery, receptivity, again, the cycles come back again, all of those things that exist outside of my body but also channel through my body, and bringing myself back to that knowing of that feminine, of the goddess, of the ways that my life can be infused by her, are those foundational points that I'm living my life from, that are in those kind of small decisions, but ultimately they're infused by those two things, if they can even be, again, considered two things.
So Yeah, I think that's perfect to set out what the sort of the foundation is. Then how does that foundation start to be created in your in the activities and the aligned actions that you take day to day?
So the first thing is so simple, but I can really see that it's one of those things that's so overlooked in terms of the power it has, is consciously creating a life, a house, a room that is bringing me back to that awareness over and over again. I mean, you've been to my house. It's quite hard to move from one place to the other without something of what I've been talking about being in my awareness. And that's very intentional, you know, from I always have a rose on my desk. That's one of the most important parts of everything I'm talking about, is to bring myself back to the awareness of the rose over and over and over again, particularly when I'm working. This is on my desk for that reason, because it's the place where I most need to be brought back to that awareness. It's the rituals that I choose into every single day at the start of my day, which I'll talk a bit about some of those rituals, but they are in terms of aligned actions, so many aren't there are obviously spontaneous actions that occur to me, but so many of them are ones that I do every single day or every single week. They are a conscious alignment of that way of living that then makes the day-to-day part of it, that kind of flow into the day, like just happen. It's harder not to live in that way when my life's been set up for me to live in that way, if that makes sense. And I think, again, I don't necessarily need to talk about my whole day, but if I suppose talk about maybe that first hour or so when I start, you know, before I start work and then as I start work, I think that will speak volumes about the rest of the day, but also, again, it is the most important part of the day because it's what seeds everything else. Everything else comes from the seed that I plant in the morning. So when I wake up, it's one of the most important things to do is to spend time in deep honoring of what's come through from my night self, from my dreams, what's present in that liminal space. I can feel myself going into a trance even thinking about that space. That for many years was something that I made myself wrong for. I thought I was just not a morning person or a bit lazy. I knew that it really affected me if I didn't have that. If I kind of had to, like, you know, jumped out of bed on an alarm, I knew that cost me. I knew that I would actually feel kind of off for the rest of the day. And I just thought, for some reason, I've got this weird system that really struggles to kind of just get out of bed and get going. And it's only been in more recent years as I've recognized like how important that space is, that I now honor it and really recognize it for what it is. It really is that opportunity to take what's been provided to me during my sleep and allow that to infuse my day. So that's, and it can look like all sorts, you know, as you know, we invite people into working with their dreams in Wake Up Crucibles. It can be just, and more that's what I do. I just be in that liminal space, allowing myself to be there and see what's being revealed. And then I will very much at that point allow that to inform what's next. That's going to vary. It could be speaking to my guides, it could be writing, it could be self-pleasure, it could be going back to sleep even, you know, there's so many things that arise from being so deeply present to my soul that's spoken so clearly in my dreams, to my body that I just come back into the awareness of. And if I'm able to honor both, when I very first wake up, there's a very good chance I'll continue to honor it for the rest of the day. If I don't, that's why I'll feel off for the rest of the day. Typically, I will start with a cup of tea that's been brought to me by my husband. So he'll bring me a cup of tea to drink in bed. And that also really helps to create that sense of like, this isn't a ritual, it isn't just a kind of I'm lazing in bed, but, you know, part of that is he brings me tea and I spend the time there enjoying it, being in that space. I'll then, what comes up next is very dependent on kind of seasons. You know, if it's warm enough, I'll often go and sit outside with my coffee and just be really like present to the spirits of the garden. So very dependent on kind of, you know, seasons and what else is going on. The bits that are absolutely happen every single day is I will then have a shower. I will speak out my decree, which probably haven't got time to get into hugely at the moment, but as you know, it's something that we really work with everyone who goes through Wake of the Wild as a means of kind of speaking ourselves into being, really bringing our full awareness to that which we're devoted to our sacred vision that we can only ever create now. And so speaking that out with, again, full presence, full awareness in that moment in the shower is something I will do every day. It's interesting at the weekends when sometimes I have a bath and I realize I haven't done it because I'm in the bath rather than the shower. And it really makes me realize like, oh gosh, it's one of those things we know, but that linking of things really helps us to keep in those rituals. Even for me, who's like so deeply devoted, if I have a bath instead of a shower, it'll be afterwards at some point I'll realize like, oh, I haven't spoken my decree today because I was in the bath. Then when I come out of the shower, I'll moisturize my whole body and really, again, be so present to my body, not see it as a kind of, here's me just slapping on some moisturizer in order to feel that I've moisturized my body. But again, real presence, real awareness of how my skin feels, how my body feels. I will then do breast massage. And again, I could probably do literally a whole episode on breast massage. Maybe one day I will. As you know, that's a practice that I invite women into, actually probably all of our clients, but particularly in Wake of the Wild Feminine. If there was one practice aside from the menstrual cycle, and we've spoken to, if there's one practice I'd suggest women start with is breast massage. And again, in that full presence to what's being felt, the relationship with the breasts, the relationship to the heart, and really allowing that to be, again, the incredibly powerful ritual it can be. I then personally have a very specific ritual I do to open my heart. I then have, and I'm not going to go into too much detail about each of these, I'm just going to name them. I then have a very specific, I think it's actually a spell. It's probably the easiest way to, it's a ritual, but it involves a spell that is a very specific one to invoke the feminine. I then, some mornings will dance. I may not every morning. That's very much whether it feels aligned in that particular moment. But then the thing that I've seen more clearly than ever over the last year or so is how important to me the ritual of applying my makeup and getting dressed is. And it took for me to be in the woods when I'm doing my shamanic work, where I'm in a tent and often it's been raining and it's muddy and we may not have had any sleep. We may have been in the sweat lodge the night before. It took that for me to realize that me not entering consciously into that ritual of doing my makeup, getting dressed in a way that feels aligned to me, the difference between the two made, and how aligned it is for me to do that ritual no matter what. And again, it isn't just about slapping makeup on. In fact, I would say when I apply my makeup, it is one of the places I most often will have revelations come through. It's a trance on its own. It's an invocation of its own. So I just want to say that because it can just seem as though this is, you know, something that we might just do in order to be, you know, look good for society. And it can be that, but it can also be this another just, you know, ritual of invocation that, again, the more I allow myself to sort of see the before, like without it and with it, I recognize actually how powerful that is. I will then come down to this room here, which is my studio stroke temple space. And I will go to my altar and spend some time at my altar, light a candle, some incense, pray. And again, with that so much of the work I do will be about an invocation of the feminine. So that's seeded through so many of the things I do, even if I've not directly spoken about it, because it is that important to me. So each of these things, I'm not naming it, but so much of it will be about the devotion to the feminine. And again, I'm not going to go through the whole day. I'll just say this final piece, and then I'd love to see what's coming up for you. As I've mentioned, I arrive here at my desk, and it is full, and you've seen this with your own eyes, it is full of items that remind me of who I am and who I'm here to be. And I say the most important part of that is the rose. A rose that I replace every week with a fresh one. And it's always there in my awareness. I have more on my altar and often have more elsewhere in my house, but it's particularly that one on my altar that reminds me over and over again. I also have, you know, skulls and crystals and feathers and, you know, a rose water spray and all sorts of other things, a goddess candle, so many other things, all of which are bringing back over and over again to that which I'm devoted to. I've also intentionally got my desk here. I'm very fortunate in that I've got this beautiful view overlooking the garden, bird feeders, so I can watch the birds come in. But again, it really allows me to be in an environment that is, you know, most people are in environments that are constantly taking them out of what they're devoted to, constantly taking them out of their wild self. Mine is created intentionally to keep inviting me back into it. So I'm going to pause there, ask me anything you want. But again, it felt important to at least say all of that day is seeded in that first hour or two.
Yeah, I think that's brilliant, and it really spoke to me when you said that time, just as you've woken up, that liminal space is where your soul meets the human, where your soul, and it was like I could see, it was like being born every day, you know, it's like that's heaven and earth, that's the meeting place. And it just filled me with all manner of emotions, including some heartbreak that for most of us we miss that. And I'm not saying you can ever be disconnected with who you are, but there is a disconnect in the sense of how we show up in the world. It's almost like the soul will be quiet then.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean? It's not that there's a true separation, but there's the choosing into living from soul. And it just really spoke to me that moment can happen. It could happen throughout the day, but you know, why not start it right there where you've been in that the human body has been in a state of sleep, and then I can't I can't really articulate how much that, just you sharing that, what I saw in that piece So important.
And in seemingly so simple, and yet there's so many reasons that we won't choose it, and it will feel impossible to choose even.
I
I
was going to
mean,
say, impossible
yeah,
to, yeah, it will
totally.
feel
And
like
some
it is.
very good reasons that I'm not dismissing. We could spend a lot of time looking at all the different challenges, and it doesn't feel like that's what we're meant to be focusing on today. As in our work, we are constantly supporting people with the very real challenges that are going to show up, that get in the way of choosing a life of soul, and looking at what the sovereign price is to pay. That's what we do constantly. It doesn't feel like that's it might be that I could personally talk about some of those, but yeah, more broadly, it doesn't feel like that's the focus of this conversation. But yes, there will be challenges, whether that be young children or having to get up to work really early, whatever the thing might be. And it feels to me that we either focus on the challenges or we focus back on that North Star of what we're devoted to.
Yeah. Yes. And I definitely want to bring in what I can hear some people say and have said to you is, well, it's easy for you. With that,
yes.
Oh, wonderful that you do all of those things in the first hour. And I know that's what you touched on just there, but I think it's deeper, that there's something a little bit deeper than that it's not easy for you, and it's more a case of this is what you've chosen and devoted to, which is why it may appear that it's easy for you.
Yeah, I think that's it's a really good one to focus on, and recognize again that we are all going to have different things that are easy or not easy for us. And it's very easy to focus on the things that look like they're easy for someone, and at a certain point in time where they may have gone through all the challenges that took them to the point where it's now easy. What I do know is that focusing on what looks like it's easier for someone else is rarely going to be the thing that allows us to create the life that we're here for. That's the thing I do know. What I also know is, and I mentioned that I've been working on this mind map. What I noticed is the more I've focused and prioritized actually what nourishes my soul, what brings me pleasure, and again, not like hedonistic numbing pleasure, but that again, things that we would do just because they feel so good. The more I've spent my time and energy focusing there, which I'm not going to show this in detail, but you can see this side here is all soul. I hadn't planned it this way. It was just that's what seemed obvious as I started to create it. The interesting thing was I suddenly realized that all of those things that are soul nourishing, pleasurable, beauty creating things, they are infusing everything else in my life. And I'm saying this with almost like a sense of shock, which I shouldn't really be at this point be so shocked, but I was amazed how much that was the case. It wasn't until I saw it visually here that I realized, oh my goodness, I could draw a line from pretty much anything on that side, that kind of soul nourishing side, to all of the other parts of my life that are powerful and aligned and abundant. And I'm like, that is so interesting, but they came from devoting to that which nourishes my soul. And it seems obvious, and it seemed like I feel like I've been saying this, teaching this for years, but it wasn't until I actually saw it written down here that I realized, like, this is unbelievable even to me that it's worked like this. All those times I've made sometimes difficult choices to prioritize things that other people would say are unimportant, selfish, are kind of shallow maybe, or like not the thing that real life is made of, the more I've said, like, it's okay that other people view this differently. It's okay that sometimes this upsets people. I know this is the place. And again, for me, so much of this, going back to the point of this, so much of this for me is about honoring the feminine, embodying the feminine, honoring my woman's body. The more I've done this, the more the rest of my life becomes this thing of absolute beauty. And that wasn't easy. Like that bit, making those choices wasn't easy. What's come from it looks incredibly easy.
So obviously people wanted to hear what a day in the life of the feminine looks like for you. And I'm guessing they're wanting to know that because they're wanting to know how they can have that as well. But are you saying then it's just not suddenly going to happen overnight? You know, what would you say, whether it's with the steps, I mean, maybe this is where being more general would be helpful, because the steps that you took aren't going to necessarily be the steps that someone else takes. So in order to have this rich devotion and embody the feminine, how does someone start?
I think recognize that if someone wants that, they've already, to some level or other, devoted to it. And there may be a kind of more conscious devotion to it that would be really serving, because again, I can't see that we can create anything of meaning, but particularly when it's going to involve challenges, without that very intentional devotion. That there's a point where we've fully chosen in. So there's a kind of difference between, oh, I'm feeling like I would like that, or I'm feeling called to that, and then that conscious choosing. And so that's the first thing I would say. And then I would say that so much of what I've spoken about, you know, that again, there's very specific rituals that I have, the very specific objects that I'll have in my awareness are important to me and may not make sense to another woman, but I do see that creating a whole day that one way or another is of ritual, is infused with your devotion, will allow you to almost like be held by it. My shamanic teacher, Jez, he's forever bringing us back to the way that in an indigenous way of life, everything is in that life is held in ritual and ceremony. And then you can be in the moment and infused by spirit within that. But the ceremony holds that, whether that be through death, whether that be through birth, whether that be coming together in celebration, whatever the thing is, it's held in ceremony and ritual. And that, I think, is one of the places of reclamation. I think it can make the biggest difference to us modern humans, us humans living in a more kind of modern life way, is that reclamation of ceremony and ritual in our lives, and ones that are right for us. We don't, probably most of us don't have ones in our culture that are actually going to serve us whatsoever, quite the opposite. So consciously create our own ceremonies and rituals. And for each person listening, that's likely to be different for them, unique to them, and consciously creating them is what's going to make the difference.
And I liked what you said earlier about the linking as well, because I know just recently I had this call to speak to a particular goddess every day, and already I noticed with going away at the weekend that you know, it come to the next morning, I'm like, oh, I didn't do what I said I was going to devote to. And I can see now that without having something to, you know, you know, to link it to, that happens in this busy, crazy modern world where we are doing this, that, and the other, and then trying to include something that's very different to the norm. It's like, how, finding ways to bring that into your day to day, that just be kind to yourself and help yourself be able to do it.
Exactly, which again is what ceremony ritual gives to us. Like, that's what it's made for. And so that linking is ultimately the ritual. Again, talking about me and my shower, the ritual is something that happens in my life anyway. Like, the ritual is to have a shower. I've used that ritual and infused it with things that are going to make it even more powerful for me. And then, of course, we can then link rituals together like this. And, whether that be, we think of rituals, I don't know, say, for example, calling in the directions before the ceremony. We know there's 7 directions. I call in this one, then this one, then this one, then this one. And then I go from calling the directions to then doing this. It just is a natural flow. And just in the same way, we can build these rituals upon each other. I know that after I've done one particular part of my series of rituals, the next one just flows automatically because I've done them so many times. The next ritual links onto it without me even need to think about it.
And how quickly you get into the rhythm of that is going to vary. I'm just foreseeing already that I'm somebody that it might take a little bit of time for that to embed, and that's okay. That's okay. It doesn't mean that it's the wrong ritual or anything like that. It can just The other piece, I know we must be.
Can I just add to that quickly, because I've described my life as being these kind of series of rituals, but it's taken me years to get to that point. I didn't start out with like all these rituals, that just wasn't there. I've obviously added things into rituals that were already there, and I've added in new rituals over time. But I would really suggest, start with one and link it as you can to rituals that are already happening. Most people do brush their teeth every day. If that's the one thing you can say, like I do without fail, link it to that. And then over time, when you recognize these rituals are just already now happening without you even needing to think about it, that's the time perhaps to introduce another one.
No, thank you for clarifying that. I really, something that keeps sort of coming up, and it did come up before we even started the conversation actually, was about the feminine speaking to us directly as opposed to some theoretical understanding, or of course there's some beautiful books about the feminine, but I'm just curious of what you have. Well, there's a couple of things. One, I would love to hear if there is a message from the feminine to listeners. And also, I'm just curious about that shift from this concept of the feminine and feeling like you know her from someone reading a book, to this embodiment. If you were able to make sense of what I'm asking there, that would be great. But I don't know, there's just something really there's just something about how we get to hear the feminine that's coming through at the moment.
It's been really interesting as you've been saying that. I've been getting the answer, but it's like an answer within an answer. It's been quite interesting watching that happen. So as you've been talking, the messages have been coming through my body, which is actually the answer to your question as well, if that makes sense.
Yes, yes, of course. We hear it through our body.
Yes, exactly. And again, that's what takes the time, to rewild, to reclaim, to heal from the shadow. She can speak so clearly through our bodies when we're open to hear her. And for many women, a lot of that closure is going to happen around, how can I say this? The aspects of our body that specifically make us women. So many of us have wounding around that, being in a woman's body and all the vulnerabilities that that brings through a sexual trauma, and creating this closure. Again, all completely understandable. Sometimes that's what's needed to protect us, to allow us to survive. And that is going to get in the way of us being able to really feel her, to be able to really hear her. And so again, the answer really is about that reconnection to our bodies. It feels as though it's kind of like paradoxical in a way. And I think in some ways we probably do need to hear from her directly, which does happen. Like the amount of women who have ended up on a call with me, I don't know, for example, to talk about joining Wake Up Feminine, and she's already speaking to them, even though they haven't been open to her. She'll call through the body or a call back to the land. That's already happening, and they'll hear more as they start to really allow themselves to see what their body is calling for. One of the biggest things I think is true for most women who have been closed, again for good reason, for traumatic reasons, have been closed to hearing the feminine, is what gets in the way of us being receptive. That word in particular, what is in the way of us being able to be receptive to life, to men, to the masculine? The very nature of a woman's body. So much we can learn, again, from the design of our body, from what takes place during sex, during procreation. So many answers lie there, and all of that relies on receptivity. And so if there is a kind of place to start, is to really start to, again, with great tenderness, real awareness, real love, recognizing why this is going to be hard work, scary work, what's in the way of receptivity. As we do that work, as we start to be able to unfold, to open, we will hear her. There is no need. Again, sometimes hearing other people's words, other teachers, can help us do that work to become receptive again. But when we start to become receptive, we hear her ourselves anyway.
And Lian, what are you hearing her say for you now? Well, it might not just be for you, but what is present for you?
That it's safe, that it's needed now. And that feels, when I now kind of bring my mind back to it, because that's just what was there to say. And, you know, at times it won't be safe. At times it will look anything but safe. And at times it will feel, and I think when I say it is ultimately what we're talking about here, embodying the feminine. It will feel anything but safe, and it will also feel anything but necessary. But what I know this, and it was just so present in that moment, it's like, that's what's being so called for right now. We need this. We need this, again, just individually, but, you know, ultimately our families need it, our communities need it. And we can do this in a way that is so safe, and actually safer than being closed to the feminine.
Yes, safer than being closed to the feminine. What question haven't I asked you? that you know needs to be answered on this in this conversation?
I keep getting random words and I haven't formed into a question yet. It's something around emotions and sensitivity. Is there a question that is clear to you from those two words? That was just.
Well, the thing that comes to mind for me with the sensitivity is another word is power, and holding that power. You mentioned that it's safe for us to embody the feminine, and it's needed for ourselves, for our family, for the community. And yet it doesn't always feel safe, and it feels too much for our system. So I'm just wondering if there's something in, are we innocently labeling that feeling of it being too much, but actually that's something else? The emotion and the sensitivity, is that actually pointing at something else?
Something else other than,
well, deeming it to be unsafe, something negative to not go towards.
yeah, this feels a great place to bring us to a place that feels like complete for now, is that this conversation is happening within a context that doesn't recognize very much of what we're talking about at the moment. We've prized not just the masculine, but really kind of, aspects of what you could either call the dark masculine or the shadow masculine for many years. And so we're having this conversation within that context where there's healing to be done in so many ways, a reclamation of the true masculine as well, an honoring of the true masculine, and this reclamation of the feminine, and the way they need to happen together in union. That's the thing that we needed to talk about. And it's, if we're either in conflict with the masculine, thinking there needs to be this kind of like, I need to focus on bringing down the patriarchy, and saying that we cannot live as sovereign beings, in this instance, women embodying the feminine, we cannot until we've dismantled what's out there. Likely it will never happen. We've devoted our lives to something that's not here for us. The more we're able to recognize that if we are devoting to the feminine and all that she brings, which is going to be in many instances quite counter to what we think is okay, is acceptable, is valuable culturally. The sensitivities and emotions were just obviously the thing that kind of took us here. But, one example of things that we don't tend to like about the feminine, if we can allow ourselves to still honor that ourselves, there's no way anyone else is going to if we're not willing to. But if we can do that, but again, with that understanding that this is happening within a context that has also diminished union between the masculine and feminine. This isn't just about it diminishing the feminine, it's actually a diminishing of the union of both. As you know, whilst this conversation has been mainly focused on my devotion to the feminine, my true devotion is to union. This can't happen in isolation. It needs to actually be a devotion to the union, to devotion, even if that isn't each woman's devotion, it still has to happen within that understanding that we can't honor the feminine without honoring the masculine. So it is hard at the moment, whilst the context is as it is, and it's safe, it's needed. And the same goes for the masculine. Thank you for asking that question.
Yeah. I just feel that sense of inner war, outer war is over. Well, that's what needs to. The focus needs to shift.
Yeah. Yes. It's so. I got into a conversation on a thread last night that was very much a kind of, the conversation started with that sense of kind of, we can point out there, to our culture or to men as to, what they need to be doing differently or what they're not seeing. Until we attend to that war in here, nothing can change.
And part of tending to that war is this whole conversation and you kindly sharing the day in the life of the feminine.
Well, a part of the day.
Not the...
You have to use your imagination for the rest of it. We've just come to a part 2 and do the afternoon. But yes, I feel like I think we've covered the main and most important things. So thank you, Sara. I really deeply appreciate you.
The feeling is unbelievably mutual. I love you so much. You're a goddess in my eyes, and purely not just because of the way you look, because of who you are, the way you are, and goodness, you're changing my life and the lives of so many other people. And I know you could say, well, that's happening, we're doing that ourselves, but you are the embodiment of the goddess, and you being who you are in the world and how you show up in the world is just having such an amazing ripple effect and impact. And I can't wait for more people to hear you, see you, and because this is not just about Lian the human, this is about how you express the goddess through you, and she speaks through you, and it's beautiful. And I feel so honored that you're in my life, so thank you.
Goodness me, what a gift, Sara. Thank you so much. So fully received. It's interesting I called you Sara then, and actually I feel like your medicine name, Noir, was actually far more apt. Mwah.